Greetings and welcome to Accounting 700. My name is Andrew Mole, and today we are going to be going over the final paper that I wrote, specifically doing the video presentation for it, and we are going to be focusing on the ethics behind taxation. So, with that being said, let's get into a general overview, which is going to be the fact that the ethics of taxation, that we're going to be looking at the ethics of taxation and seek to determine the morality of taxes. Are taxes good? Are they bad? Are they moral? Or are they immoral? The tax system is examined, as well as the arguments surrounding the support and disagreement with taxation. Lastly, the psychological mindset behind tax evasion is examined to see if there are any logical or moral sense behind those stances. So, with that being said, let's dive into it. So, what are taxes and why should I care? Taxes have been around historically for as long as anyone can remember. You can look at manuscripts and whatnot going back thousands of years, and you can see that taxes were around. Taxes are defined as the money that people are required to pay the government. This is not option. This is not an optional gift to the government. This is by law. You have to pay this amount of money to the government. Taxes are one primary source of income for the government, and the main reason that people should care about taxes is the fact that if the taxes are immoral, or if the amount that they're paying is immoral, then, or if we can find reasons that people should not be paying as much as they are, then taxes, by process of logical reasoning, should be lower. If taxes are lower, then especially as the economy is struggling, as people are going into hard times, even if the general economy is doing great, a lot of people's personal economy is not doing well. Lower taxes means more money in their pocket, more money for the bills they can't pay, more money for the things that they want, more money for the things that they need. It's more money when you don't have to put out any extra effort is always a great thing, as long as it's legal and moral. Okay. So, scope of the research. The application of this research is limited to the ethics behind taxation. What we are not studying, what we are not diving into, is the IRS legal? Should the states have more control over the taxes? Should the states be demanding tribute from one another as goods go across their lines? Should the interstates be free? There's tons of other questions that we could ask about tax, but none of those are applicable to today. We are not diving into how much money people should morally be paying to taxes. Again, all those are fantastic studies, but they are well beyond the depth and scope of this paper. What we are specifically addressing is the thesis that taxes can be both moral and immoral. Now, further defining of the scope, we are looking broadly at the ethics behind taxation. We are not diving into specific governments, other than showcasing a few tax examples. But we are not saying, okay, this government's taxes are good, this one's bad. We're just saying generally, are taxes good or bad? Should we have the tax system that we have now? Should we consider something different? But again, we're just speaking very generally about the ethics of taxation, and we are not diving into specifics of tax systems, just the ethical mindset behind those systems, not specifics on how they work or anything like that. So, how was the research conducted? Research was conducted using the Franklin University Library and accessing various journals, databases, and peer-reviewed articles. All the data and research is less than 10 years old, save one timeless article. Key terms that you should know. Tax obligation is the amount of money that the government has determined that a person owes in taxes. Tax gap is the amount of money that the government failed to collect compared to what it had calculated that it should collect from, say, from either the tax population under its control, or you can even use the tax gap to apply to an individual. So if, say, Johnny was supposed to pay $10,000 in taxes, he found some tax loopholes, and now he's paying $5,000. He has a tax gap of $5,000. If Sally was supposed to pay $1 in taxes and she paid 25 cents, there's 75 cents of a tax gap that the government did not collect. So, tax avoidance is a legal manner to lower the tax one pays or to legally avoid paying specific taxes. Tax avoidance, that you can also say tax loopholes. Loopholes are legal manners. They're areas of the law where somebody says, hey, I can use that to go to pay less taxes. So people can use loopholes to pay less taxes, and they are legal. Later in the paper, we'll discuss the arguments that are for loopholes and others saying that they're unethical. Okay, so tax avoidance, legal manner to lower taxes. The tax loopholes are the leeways in the law, tax laws that allow someone to pay taxes. So tax avoidance, you're using a legal way to lower the taxes, like tax loopholes. Tax evasion, refusing to pay taxes owed to the government or using illegal methods to avoid taxes. Taxpayer is a person paying the taxes. Other than that, it's all the other words, you just have to look in a dictionary. Okay. All right. So there are several. So going into our findings in the research, or you could say the main body of the research. So number one, there are seven. Okay, so diving into the first finding, which is morality of taxation via the cost-benefit ratio, there are several different arguments for and against this for the morality of taxation. Specifically, the cost-benefit ratio is the main argument for taxes. So Nardi, in his 2023 work, page 19, defines the cost-benefit ratio as the cost being the number of people harmed, the benefit being the number of people helped, and the fact that if more people are helped than are harmed, then he says that the taxation is good, or you can use it, and it's applied to a specific tax code. So if a specific tax helps more people than it hurts, then it's good. And the reverse is also true according to this ethical theory, that if more people are harmed than are helped, then said tax is bad. The other argument that Nardi puts forth is the pro-tax argument, that if the tax is working as intended, then it's good. If it does not work as intended, then it's bad. And the weakness of those arguments is that it makes the assumption, the weakness of the cost-benefit ratio argument specifically, makes assumptions on the number of people that are harmed. So it might look at things like the number of people that lost their homes due to property taxes being much smaller than the number of people that didn't, and therefore it says, well, since the government's helping a lot of people and taxes are one of the main ways that it gets money, then if more people are able to pay than aren't able to pay, then it's still a good tax because most people are less affected. Most people aren't hurt by this tax because they can pay it. What it does not take into account are the fact that increased tax burdens through either the number of taxes or through the increasing of said taxes that are already in place hurts the poor person. It makes necessities like toilet paper and food less obtainable. It puts a tighter crunch on families, and it limits, say, their ability to go places, the ability to pay for fuel. It limits sometimes their having to put bills on credit cards. Well, then the credit cards come due and they can't pay those, but the tax, even though the tax causes, or say, for example, an income tax, because they're getting less money now in their paycheck due to an increase in income taxes, well, that now then puts a strain on their other finances, and now they can't afford groceries, and now they can't afford gas to get to work, and if they didn't have that tax, then they could. So it doesn't take into account the overall effect of those very hard and I would say almost impossible calculations on how the taxes affect the general population, especially the working class. Higgs puts in his 2017 work on page 478, puts forth an argument against the cost-benefit ratio. Higgs contends against the cost-benefit ratio argument, and he states that the morally reprehensible acts of genocide or any sort of evil that you wish to put in there could be justified by the cost-benefit ratio, and he uses the Nazis as an example where the Nazis would round up the Jews. The extermination of the Jews was the cost. The benefit were the benefits that the Nazis claimed their society would receive by the Jews not being there. So the cost-benefit ratio plays out in Hitler's favor. That does not make what he did good, and that is the whole point of Higgs, is that this cost-to-benefit ratio, it always hurts somebody and it justifies bad things. However, he recommends instead, and this is from Higgs' 2017 work on page 477 to 478, instead he recommends the Hippocratic Oath as a tax system, so a do-no-harm system. And he recommends it even for the government as well. If a system is based on do no harm, then if it harms somebody, it's immediately thrown away. It's immediately considered morally wrong. However, if the main, I think, benefit of a do no harm system is the fact that it's very clear, it is very concise. Systems and laws are very clearly good or bad based on the do no harm criteria. And it is a lot easier to say something is morally good or morally bad when bad things can't be justified. The do no harm argument, the do no harm moral code, the do no harm ethical stance is a very clear stance. It's a very concise stance. Bad things can't be justified because they harm somebody. It makes everything very clear and very there is no wiggle room for evil systems or for evil with that moral code. And that's Higgs' argument in a nutshell. Moving on to the second step, the second finding, which is one of the main arguments against taxation, is the fact that taxation is used as a form of control. According to Crane, Denton, Holcomb, and Tolson, and their work, in their 1977 work, page 239, and again, a list of works and whatnot will be given in the reference section, so just bear with me, and that will be given at the very end of the presentation here. So, what they argue is that the syntaxes are also called sumptuary taxes, and they are designed to impose a penalty tax on a certain item or a certain action. Specifically in the United States, you had the alcohol and tobacco tax, which I believe is still in existence, and that imposed a separate tax and a higher tax on alcohol and tobacco with the hope that people would look at the price of the item and say, well, it's too expensive, it's easier to abstain than partake, and therefore they wouldn't buy it. So it was trying to define morality through taxation. Moving into the future, Venkatasan, and that is in her work, her 2020 work, page 144 to 146. She talks about the sugar tax that was introduced in 2018 to the UK. So yeah, the syntax way back then used as a form of control, and then we see a recent example of how taxes are used as a form of control. And this prompts much debate was over whether sugar taxes are good or bad, but the main point of this is to really bring up to thought that if taxes are used as a form of control, if there's proven uses of control for taxes are proven to be used as a form of control in one area, how are they not used as a form of control in other areas? People can't afford cars because they can't afford to pay the taxes on the vehicle, or the inspection, or the registration. All those are fees that people have to pay in addition to maintaining the vehicle, in addition to putting gas in the tank, in addition to buying tires, etc. So there's a lot of other fees associated with that. Home ownership, taxes. People lose their homes because they can't afford the taxes. So if the taxes if they could be used as a form of control, if they have been used as a form of control, then are they truly moral if they are being used to control people? There is a moderate author named Lafever. I cannot pronounce his name very well. He's French. He, in his 2017 work on page 782, he believes that there are two reasons that people across the board would agree to pay taxes, and that is for emergency services and national defense. He said outside of those, how much to pay tax-wise, other government projects, etc., anything outside of those two reasons, he said that's where the debate and disagreement with taxation comes from. Al S4 and Salim agree with him to a point in their 2023 work on page 128, but they believe that taxes morally should be used. They expand his reasoning and say that there are actually 5 reasons that taxes should be in place, and they believe that they are fairly reasonable. And that is, 1, to provide benefit to the public, just generally speaking, to redistribute money, and I'm assuming that is through programs that provide benefit to people like food stamps, housing, etc. 3, promote education and health among people, such as free health care. 4, provide economic stability through low levels of inflation and low levels of unemployment. And 5, taxes that should also be gathered just to help the government in general in enforcing regulations and laws. Venkatasan, in her 2020 work on page 142, she believes that the argument for taxation is based on the grounds that the government promotes public welfare and aids the citizens through the use of tax dollars. Proponents of taxation, according to Venkatasan, claim that taxation is a moral duty and a civil obligation, and to evade taxes is to deny one's moral obligations. Taxation is justified via the evolution of the fairness of the taxes, and it is also justified in how the tax dollars are spent and the role of the state in the lives of the people, according to Venkatasan. The 4th finding is in regards to wealth redistribution. According to Lafever, in his 2017 work on page 783, remember he is a moderate, he believes that even dissenters of taxation believe in wealth redistribution. He believes that the dissenters believe that the free market or the economy redistributes wealth evenly and fairly, well, not evenly, but fairly redistributes wealth, whereas those that are proponents of taxation believe that the government artificially redistributing wealth is a good thing. He argues that people are, regardless of what people claim, they are both for the wealth redistribution. However, not everyone agrees with that. Bloom explains in his 2016 work on page 955, he explains that historically taxation has occurred to exclusively maintain law and order, which goes back to the argument of Lafever earlier, where he said that taxes, most people agree that law and order should be in emergency services, national security, things like that. Taxes are a good thing if they're used exclusively for those areas. Is when taxes expand to cover other stuff that people disagree with. Anyway, so Bloom says that historically taxation was exclusively used to maintain law and order, and that taxes do not redistribute wealth, as many have claimed. Again, we're referring to modern taxes, but instead are a tool and have been historically used as such for class warfare to oppress the poor and to keep the position of the rich from being threatened within society by the up-and-coming middle class. Bloom quotes Tony Honoro, Honor spelled an E, who states that apart from law, no one has a moral obligation to pay any particular amount of tax, as Bloom, page 967 to 968. Honor explains that fairness in the tax system does not truly exist, nor would the government be able to function under the idea that people should decide for themselves how much to pay. Again, 967 to page 968. Thus, Bloom's conclusion is that taxation represses rather than aids the poor and hampers people from climbing the economic ranks, page 955. The main, I think, point that we need to take away from here, Tony Honoro, by the way, he was a high up in one of the government agencies regarding taxation. I forget which one. And he then went into private practice. I believe he worked for the IMF or the IRS. I don't remember exactly. Anyway, the whole point of Bloom is that taxation does not, according to Bloom and Tony Honor, taxation does not redistribute wealth. All it does is oppress people. And again, Lafayette disagrees with that, and so do multiple other people that claim that taxation does indeed. And those were, the works like Van Catteson, who believe that taxes are fair and that they redistribute wealth. I think the main argument for redistributing wealth is that those are for the wealth redistribution through taxation. Based on my studies, they believe that the government takes the money and uses it for public services, and that's how the wealth is redistributed through services like education, like public school, like free education, and in the governments where healthcare is free, through free healthcare. All right, moving on to the fifth area, which is closing the tax gap. Tax gap, remember from our keywords, refers to the amount of money that the government failed to collect compared to what it had calculated that it should collect if every citizen pays what it's supposed to. The tax gap can be created through legal means such as tax loopholes and illegal means such as tax evasion. The question is, do people have a moral duty to voluntarily close the tax gap through paying higher taxes? If the answer is no, then it's questionable if the taxation is truly moral in the first place. However, if closing the tax gap is indeed a moral obligation, then so is obviously paying taxes. Common sense goes a long way there. Okay, so according to Breder Road, 2020, page 54, he believes that according to Hobbes' social contract theory, individuals give up their rights to the government to gain safety and protection. And Breda Rhodes' work, 2020 work on page 5, he quotes Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract theory, and it coincides with Hobbes. And both theories would insist that people living within a state or country should close the tax gap out of moral obligation by not avoiding taxes and by paying what they are deemed to owe. Ostis, in his 2020 work on page 90, he would agree with both Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Brederode. Ostis believes that the system of taxation only works if people pay what tax planners have calculated that they should pay. If people don't pay what they are calculated to need to pay, then there is a loss of revenue for the government, or the tax gap. Part of morally interpreting tax laws, according to Ostis, is embracing the spirit of the tax law rather than just taking it literally. Ostis argues that the tax system is fair because it limits the government from arbitrarily imposing taxes without a law first being in place. It also limits government officials from arbitrarily taxing people. Thus, the sentiment of the taxpayer, according to Ostis, should not be to view taxes as a cost-to-benefit ratio, but to see paying taxes as a moral obligation. And this is from page 90 and 92. According to Narty, in his 2023 work on page 260, and his study on the neurological link to taxes, and morality. His feeling is that moral people do not avoid taxes, nor do they cheat on their taxes, but rather they pay their fair share. According to Nardi, in order to live with dignity and to hold on to virtue, people must pay their fair share of taxes. The less moral are those that are locked into a cognitive bias and try to avoid paying their fair share of taxes, whether it be through legal means, such as tax loopholes, or less than legal means, such as tax evasion. According to Stephen Johnson, and this is regarding and he is against tax gap closing. According to Stephen Johnson and many tax preparers, research, and lawyers, and the like, so the entirety of the tax community agree. The majority of the tax community agree that it is their moral obligation to assist the taxpayer, which is their client, in finding and exploiting tax loopholes. The tax community considers one as going against best practice if that person does not assist their client in paying the absolute legal minimum on their taxes. According to a former IRS acting chief counsel, he is even quoted as stating that using tax loopholes is his duty not only to his client but to the tax system. By exploiting tax loopholes, taxpayers illegally increase the tax gap by paying less than what the government has originally calculated them paying. Specifically, somebody who is against tax loopholes can be found in the work of Daniel Ostes and Axel Hilling. This is different from the Ostes work that we quoted earlier. And their work was in 2016 on page 748. They argue against tax loopholes, citing that the morality of those working as tax advisors, preparers, etc. are instead morally obligated to close the tax gap. The tax gap is defined as the difference between the income tax and the income tax as collected. So, the income tax due and the income tax collected. It is argued that about 1/5 of the taxes are not collected annually due to loopholes and tax evasion, and the number equates to about $3 billion in the United States. So, and in their study, even in the UK, again, it was about 1/5 of the taxes were not collected. So, generally speaking, when we look at a nation, there is likely going to be about 1/5 of their taxes are not collected due to loopholes and tax evasion. The conclusion of the tax gap matter, it comes down to the real question then becomes, whose interest is the tax community most beholden to? Is it the federal government in closing the tax gap, or is it their clients and helping their clients pay the absolute minimum? If the moral obligation is to aid the government, then the tax community should strive to ensure that as many taxes as possible are paid and collected. However, if it is to one's client, then the community is required to save the client as much money legally as possible through the use of tax breaks, loopholes, and the like, which makes it their legal. Alright, so the sixth topic that we're going to cover is why taxpayers become tax evaders. Several researchers have studied how people go from a taxpayer to a tax evader, and all of them have found very similar data to conclude that it is a process and it does not happen overnight. The questions that we must ask ourselves are these. Are these positions that these tax evaders hold, are they reasonable? And if the research in the process of people becoming tax evaders is logical, then is it possible that any person in similar circumstances would also become a tax evader? Secondly, another question to ponder is, would a different tax system, such as do no harm, change the reasoning and desire of tax evaders to cheat on their taxes? Excuse me. First study. According to Al-Asfour and Salim, there are 3 stages that lead a taxpayer to seek tax evasion and to justify it morally. The first is the perception of the taxpayer that the government is evil. If the taxpayer views the government as corrupt and evil, then tax evasion is justified in their eyes, and the justification of tax evasion is the first step. However, if the government is using tax dollars effectively to aid people, and if the public perceives the government as being good and just, then they are less likely to evade taxes. The second step is the burden that taxes are upon the taxpayer. We talked about earlier taxes, really hurting the poor, making it hard to maintain a vehicle, making it hard to buy clothes because they can buy one piece of clothing for $5 plus taxes at $6. Well, they can't buy the $1 pair of socks because of the taxes on the socks. Put the socks above $1, so they only have $6. So what do they get? Socks or pants? So it hurts the poor. So if they perceive the government as evil, if the taxes place an undue burden upon the person, maybe the taxes are too high and the person struggles to pay their taxes or to pay their monthly bills because of the taxes. So when taxes place a financial hardship on somebody, they advance to stage 3. Stage 3 is the reference group and the consequences of tax evasion. If everybody in the community of the taxpayer, soon to be tax evader, is for tax evasion, then they are going to be more likely to evade taxes. However, if the people within the community are against tax evasion, it will slow down their process of transforming into a tax evader. So it's the community. So stage 3 is the reference groups that the people attach themselves to, the community, and the penalties for tax evasion, which you could also probably add the likelihood of getting caught into that as well. Lambarton and Nava and Norton found similar results, and this is in their 2018 work in page 310. So Asfar and Salim was from page 132 in their 2023 work. Lambarton and his associates, 2018, page 310. The first step is very similar to the second step of Salim, or excuse me, Al Asfar and Salim's. The first step in Lambarton and his associates is the taxpayer psychologically discovering the lack of benefit from the government compared to the amount of money that he is paying. Again, this is the cost-benefit ratio, morality code of ethics, where the taxpayer sees their money and says, you know what, I'm not, all the taxes I'm paying, the hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes, I'm not really getting the benefit from the government that I should be. Therefore, they have no desire to pay taxes. So, step 1 is having a negative view of the government and the use of their tax dollars. Second step of the argument is the lack of control or input on how the tax dollars were spent. Researchers found that those who had a positive view of the use of their tax dollars by the government were noticeably more compliant with tax laws and less willing to cheat on their taxes. This study conducted showed that a lot of people who had a say in the tax dollars, there was an experiment done, and the people that had a say in how the tax dollars were spent were way more compliant and way more willing to give money for taxes willingly, as opposed to those who did not have a say. People who the study conducted by the researchers conclude that non-compliance comes about due to a perception in the misuse of tax dollars and a lack of ability to change the misuse of the money, the lack of ability of being able to control how the money was spent. And that is from Lambarton and his associates, page 310 through 312, as well as 322 through 323. Seventh step. So the seventh study, the seventh finding that we have is kind of goes along with this, which is the perception of the government affects tax compliance. Several researchers have found that the effect of the government, the effect of the perception of people of the government directly affects their willingness to comply with taxation. A study of ACC700 from his 2024 study, pages 8 and 9. He concluded that the morality of taxation is linked to trust in the government and its enforcing bodies. The more one trusts his government, the more that person is willing to comply with tax laws and is actively engaged in his community. On the other hand, the less that one trusts his government and the less that he's willing to pay, the less that he trusts his government, it means the less that he's willing to pay in taxes. And the more that he considers tax fraud justifiable. The solution to increase tax support, then, according to this study, is to increase trust in the government and its enforcing bodies, such as the police and military. And this is from ACC700's 2024 work, pages 8 through 10. McGee, Yoon, and Lee concur with the perception theory, where the perception of the taxpayer of his government shapes his tax compliance. Their research led them to conclude that the morality of paying taxes is dependent on the government and that is dependent on the government that the payees are under. And this is from the 2015 work, pages 61 through 69. From page 161 through 169. For example, governments that have many human rights abuses and are corrupt or are seen by their citizens as such and are seen by their citizens as not deserving their tax dollars, are these people, these citizens of that government, deem tax evasion as justifiable and are way more willing to engage in tax evasion. And that was based on a acute study that they did in specifically dealing with Yemen. And they also did studies on a few other countries. So in conclusion, what we really want to look at is the ethics behind each of these 7 scenarios. So how do these scenarios show that taxation is ethical or unethical? The morality of taxation via the cost-benefit ratio. If you consider the cost-benefit ratio versus the do no harm. Both of them are very different tax systems. You can see the ethical reasoning behind each of those. And then you have the argument for which brings the arguments for taxation. So why taxes are good? They redistribute wealth. Is the redistribution of wealth ethical or not? If it helps people, then, and according to the cost-benefit ratio, if it helps people more than it harms them, then that's good. According to do no harm, it could be considered otherwise. Argument against taxation. Are taxes a form of control? If the taxes are a form of control, then are they truly ethical? Are taxes ethical if they harm people? That goes back to your whether you do cost system ratio or whether you do no harm. Are taxes ethical if they harm someone? Are they ethical if they are a form of control? Are they ethical if they help people by through the redistribution of wealth? If taxes are ethical, then you have the moral obligation to pay. If they are not ethical, then you have the moral obligation to not pay and to help other people not pay, which is the tax gap, the legal tax avoidance or the legal loopholes, the legal obligation to help people pay would be to close the loopholes, legally close the loopholes, and also to not advise clients about the loopholes if taxes are good. Why do people evade taxes? Well, it's typically a negative perception of the government, which is dealt with in the 7th finding, as well as the fact that people do not feel that the taxes help them. It goes back to the cost-benefit ratio. People feel they're more harmed than good, than they have their community around them. So the morality behind ethics is very complex, and really it comes down to we have to ask ourselves, are taxes ethical? I do not believe that this study gives a concrete conclusion on the ethical nature of taxes. I think it raises a lot of questions. So the implications of this research, there are several gaps of the research that should be followed up on. There are a plethora of theories that are for taxation. However, there are a distinct lack of theories that are put forth against taxation. Some theorists that the current research recommends and that have not been dived into are John Locke and Ronald M. Green. Ronald M. Green has a work of ethics and taxation theoretical framework. Unfortunately, his work fell outside of the parameters of our scope of research, so we were not able to dive into it and include it. More precise research dealing strictly with the arguments for and against taxation should be conducted, but the research that is conducted in that manner should not be limited to staying within 10 years of the date, and it should not be limited strictly to scholarly sources that are peer-reviewed. The research of the ethics behind taxation is important for the practice of accounting as a whole because it shapes how moral accounts are handled in the area of taxation. As mentioned previously, a pro-tax accountant will not show his clients tax breaks to aid them in limiting their taxation. However, if he is against taxes, then he is going to help them through every legal means at his disposal, including tax loopholes and the like. A more definitive answer on taxes being ethical or not would help shape the fundamentals of the tax community. It would help define best practice. So, yes, theoretically, most people believe that best practice is saving money. However, a more definitive answer of yes, best practice is paying the lowest amount possible versus, well, it might be, it might not be, and it's depending on who you ask. So a more definitive answer, more definitive set-in-stone ethics can be made based on whether or not the taxes are ethical. So the overall conclusion is that the study has shown that ethics and taxation are linked to the perception of the morality of the government, and further research should be conducted into the view of people on morality of the government, not their approval of it. If people view the government as moral, then taxes will increase. If they view it as immoral, then their reasoning behind that would show a way that the government could fix that perception and thereby passively increase their tax revenue because people will be more willing to pay. Do most people feel that the government is corrupt? Do they feel that the government spends its money wisely, or do they view the government as spending as wasteful? If the answer to these questions is yes, then tax evasion will rise with non-compliance. Also, if these answers are yes, then are taxes to such a immoral government moral? Is it moral? Is it a moral obligation to pay? It's a legal obligation. Is it a moral obligation? Is the question. If the government is good, if it is not corrupt, if their spending of tax dollars is wise, then it would be a moral obligation to pay that government. If the government would fix the perception, then I think the conclusion really is that the government would fix even just the perception of people of it, and tax compliance will rise. If it does not, then the tax evasion will become more rampant, especially as times get harder. Now, as promised, we are going to dive into references. Alright, as promised, we are going to go over the references for everything that was used in this study. Specifically, these are in alphabetical order, and there are 15 of them. So, hang on to your hats, folks. Alright, ALS-4, 2024, Reevaluating Ethical Justifications for Discriminatory Tax Rates in the Global Economy. As from the Journal of Accounting, Ethics and Public Policy, or JAEPP, Volume 25, Issue 2, pages 15 through 25. The second is ALS-4 and Salim from their 2023, Tax Ethics and Tax Compliance Evidence from Emerging Markets. That is from the Corporate Governance and Organizational Behavior Review, Volume 7, Issue 4, pages 127 through 136. Third source is Bloom, 2016, Tax Avoidance, A View from the Dark Side, and that is from the Melbourne University Law Review, Volume 39, Issue 3, pages 1 through 29. Brederode Van, that is the editor. That is from 2020. That's from the work Ethics and Taxation. It's an ebook, and it's from Springer. And that was got that online. Okay. Cizenko, 2024, What Shapes Tax Morality in Younger Generations, a comparative analysis between Gen Y and Gen Z. And that is from the Sociology Compass, Volume 18, Issue 2, pages 1 through 14. Sixth work is Crane, Deaton, Holcomb, and Tolson, 1977, Rational Choice and the Taxation of Sin. That's from the Journal of Public Economics, Volume 8, Issue 2, pages 239. The seventh is Higgs, and that is from 2017. First, Do No Harm. That's from the Independent Review, Volume 21, Issue 3, pages 477 through 78. And eighth is Johnson, 2021, Federal Tax Ethics, Rules, and State Malpractice Litigation. The Tax Lawyer, Volume 75, Issue 1, pages 125 through 186. The ninth is Liberton. Let me pull this up a little better. Okay, Liberton and D. Neve and Norton, 2018, The Power of Voice in Stimulating Mortality. Eliciting taxpayer preferences increases tax compliance. That is from the Journal of Consumer Psychology and John and Wiley Sons Incorporated, Volume 28, Issue 2, pages 310 through 328. Number 10, Lafevre, 2017, Justice and Taxation, Vermont Law Review, Volume 41, Issue 4, pages 763 through 798. 11, McGee, Yoon, and Lee, 2015, The Ethics of Tax Evasion, a comparative study of Chinese and U.S. opinions, Indonesian Journal of International and Comparative Law, Volume 2, Issue 1, pages 161 through 186. Nardi, 2023, Neurological Aspect of Ethics and Integrity, a Fundamental Compound Element of Law and Tax Compliance. That is from the Athens Journal of Law, AJL, Volume 9, Issue 2, pages 245 through 274. 13, Ostas, 2020, Ethics of Tax Interpretation, Journal of Business Ethics, Volume 165, Issue 1, page 83 through 94. 14, Ostis and Hilling, 2016, Global Tax Shelters, The Ethics of Interpretation and the Need for a Pragmatic Jurisprudence. That's from the American Business Law Journal, Volume 53, Issue 4, page 745 through 786. And then 15 is Venkatasan, 2020. That is Afterward, Putting Together the Anthropology of Tax and the Anthropology of Ethics. And that is a social analysis, 60 social analysis, as Volume 64, Issue 2, pages 141 through 54. And I will be including with my submission to the YouTube links, I'll be including a copy of the work that I did of the study. That way you can read it and follow along as you see fit. Thank you and have a wonderful day. Best wishes.